His job as a manager is to look out for the professional and financial well-being of those he represents. The question I ask you, the viewer, is he doing that job ethically and effectively? It may seem like this creates a highway for the most talented fighters to reach the UFC. Instead, it's a Byzantine bureaucracy benefiting the politically connected over those deserving. What happens when he is the next Abdelaziz? So, I made a video.
Even the Krause thing. I mean, there's something you gotta, if you want to listen to something good, somebody did a really good piece on the betting thing and what they think is going on. It's pretty wacky, but sensible. I think you'll find it on YouTube.
Is it like the 90-minute version?
Yeah, it's a long one. Yeah.
My twin.
Jack, there's a video I want to mention that I'll be referencing in a second in a different news story. Did you see that thing that MMA put out? The headline of their clip was the UFC has a major gambling problem. Yes. James Krause is only the beginning. And I want to shout out one more time that MMA video, which really put all the facts in the forefront. Check, this goes deeper, this Krause thing, than I really even realized.
But to be honest with you, it wasn't my best work. My pacing was atrocious. I said Adidas instead of Reebok on at least 5 separate occasions. But I released when I did for a reason. The UFC has a much larger structural flaw rotting at the foundation. On December 6th of 2022, James Krause was barred from coaching fighters in a minor Midwestern U.S. MMA promotion known as FAC, or Fighting Alliance Championship. I found this very odd and vindictive. Why would the UFC strong-arm a tiny, barely known promotion into cutting Krause out? You see, Krause was only banned from licensing in Nevada, not Missouri, where FAC holds its events. So I continued to read. Quoting Purdue, Joe Wooster, a licensed matchmaker in Missouri and co-founder of FAC, told ESPN on Monday that Krause will have nothing to do with FAC 17. James is not any part of our ownership group, Wooster said when reached by phone. He's not the licensed promoter, not the licensed matchmaker. Just like every promotion in the Midwest, we use a bunch of his fighters, but he's in no way, shape, or form involved in the event. I know that the UFC kind of branded it James Krause's FAC, and that's just kind of what they do to extend their audience. They always try to associate a fighter with a promotion. That's where James kind of got his involvement. Later that same day, MMA insiders reported the following, which was confirmed by MMA Mania. Quote, Krause had decided to sell all ownership in Glory MMA and Fitness, along with its affiliates, to FAC owner and Iridium Sports agent Joe Wooster. Wooster, it turns out, runs the Midwestern U.S. region of Iridium's fighter management arm. As such, Wooster is simultaneously an MMA matchmaker and an MMA agent. This introduces the possibility of conflicts of interest. To understand that term simply, a conflict of interest occurs when an individual's personal interests, family, friendships, financial, or social factors, can compromise his or her judgment, decisions, or actions in the workplace. To contextualize this example, could Wooster choose a fighter he represents when a big fight is being lined up for a FAC card over that of a more deserving but non-Iridium fighter in FAC? The important thing to note is that it doesn't have to have occurred for it to be considered a conflict of interest. It's purely the assertion that it could happen that constitutes a conflict. That binary is incredibly important to understand. It's all about the perception of impropriety. So why is Krause selling his gym to his agent? A reasonable question. But unfortunately, it's not one that has any publicly reported reasoning to it. If we are to understand the dynamics at play, we are going to have to discuss Iridium as a whole. This is Jason House, founder and CEO of Iridium Sports Agency. House went onto the MMA Hour in mid-November of 2022 to discuss various aspects of Iridium and his star client, Brandon Moreno. Here he is discussing his beginnings in the sport.
So your history in the sport, it's been going back well over a decade, right? Yeah. And actually, in doing a little bit of research on you, a name popped up that I had not heard of in quite some time. A guy that I used to be quite close with, Ken Pavia.
Yes.
The new fans watch it. The ESPN fans, they don't know Ken Pavia. Yeah. But the OGs know Ken Pavia. Yeah. So he's the reason why you got into this?
Yes, he actually spoke to my law school.
This is Ken Pavia, former MMA manager himself. Yeah.
Yes, he came to my law school the last semester of my last year in law school.
What school?
Whittier Law School in Costa Mesa, in Orange County, California.
And here he is talking about the timeline of his launching of Iridium.
When do you actually start Iridium? When does that launch?
So I graduated law school, I think like May 24th of 2009. I formed it August 20th of 2009.
So House has been working as an agent for over a decade now, but his success is altogether relatively recent. Everything changed for House rapidly with the launch of the UFC's new talent acquisition pipeline.
Take the test, pass, start working with football players, and then the Contender Series starts in 2017. And we had a lot of initial success. You know, our agency's always been a grassroots of building athletes on the regional scene and getting them to the UFC. Then 2018 came and it grew even more. And then it became a point where I realized, man, do I want to fight for a market share in the NFL, maybe be a jack of all trades, master of none? Or do I stick with my passion, my calling, and go all in on MMA? And we decided to do MMA.
House hints at it here, but his ability to get fighters onto the show and win them contracts really exploded Iridium into one of the premier management agencies in the UFC. In fact, they may have the largest roster of pro MMA fighters as well as active UFC fighters.
He sent me your roster. You represent over 300 UFC MMA athletes, correct?
Correct.
How is that possible? How do you have the mental capacity, the time, the energy? And I know you have other people who work for Iridium as well. But 300 is a massive number. Dare I say probably the biggest number in the sport?
Probably.
I don't see anyone coming close to that. How is that possible?
There, Ariel asks the key question. How is that possible? MMA management as an industry is tremendously stagnant. The top managers today have been the top managers for a long, long time. Here's House talking about what he considers one of the keys to his success.
How did you develop, one thing I always hear about you is you have a very good relationship with the UFC brass. Some managers don't, some do. But I always hear that you're, in very good standing with them. There's a science to that as well, right? That could be a tricky dance. Sometimes they like managers, sometimes they don't.
Yeah.
How did you develop that good relationship? And in particular, I think it's with Sean and Mick, the matchmakers, but it seems like everyone at the UFC has a lot of respect for you.
Quickly, let's establish who those two figures are. First, Sean Shelby. Sean is the matchmaker for the following men's divisions in the UFC. And conversely, here is Mick Maynard and the men's divisions he handles. Okay, back to House's answer.
How did that happen?
Really, I just treat it like my marriage, right? I keep those discussions behind closed doors. I think one of the things that I learned on the football side was that anytime a negotiation went public, it didn't really end well, right? Ego gets involved, people are upset, things were said publicly. I've always tried to keep things behind closed doors, and that's not to say I don't get into it with Mick or Sean or Hunter or any of them, but I think if we keep it in a professional manner and keep it behind closed doors, it always maintains that relationship because what you always have to keep in mind, this is the infinite game, right? This is a long-lasting relationship. That's probably a 20, 30, 40-year relationship for me, right? And so I have to treat it with that respect and care in every negotiation. So
therein lies the key to House's rise. House rejects the slimy aspects of management in the form of poaching fighters in favor of a much more professional and symbiotic relationship with executives and even other managers, as he states here.
Is there a number that you're like, all right, we can't surpass this? I can't get to 400. I can't get to 500.
It really depends on what acquisitions we decide to make this year. If we, merge with other agencies or we partner with other agents, I think that really will determine that. A lot of our growth has been, partnering with other agents. So that's why it may seem like a lot as a number, but then when you think about it, we're bringing in the infrastructure to sustain that model.
But something really stuck in my head from an earlier clip I played.
Take the test, pass, start working with football players, and then the Contender Series starts in 2017. And we had a lot of initial success. Our agency's always been a grassroots of building athletes on the regional scene and getting them to the UFC.
If we sort of read between the lines of what House is saying in that clip, his strategy really wasn't all that effective until the launch of DWCS and the opening it created for Iridium and its clients to get seen and signed to the UFC, right? So is there more beneath the surface to how House went from essentially irrelevancy to fielding the largest MMA roster in the sport? This is a data-based channel. I have my own opinions, but if they lack data backing, I tend to abandon them. As such, I did something stupid. I went through every single Dana White's Contender Series fight in history and manually pulled if the fighter was managed by Iridium at the time of the fight. In a way, we can use this data to approximate how successful Iridium is at bringing talent on to the UFC. In the spirit of open sourcing knowledge, I have a copy of all the fights and my labeling of them uploaded for free over on our Patreon, which you can find a link to in the description. Before I get to the results though, you the viewer should keep in mind 2 facts. 1, Iridium's website, which I used for this section, is not up to date with our entire roster. There are numerous fighters that I know they rep, but aren't on the website. As such, my numbers are probably underestimating totals. And 2, there are numerous misspellings on their website. I did my best to fix them, but it is certainly possible that a misspelled name or 2 caused me to undercount just how many fighters they represent. So, if we take all male Dana White Contender Series fights from the beginning of the show to present, Iridium has repped 88 fighters out of a total of 518. 53 of those 88 won their fights. We can say that Iridium alone accounts for nearly 17% of all male fighters that enter into Dana White's Contender Series. But more importantly though, Iridium fighters win a strong 60% rate. As I was pulling those names though, I began to notice another trend with Iridium's roster. They manage a ton of ranked fighters at flyweight and bantamweight. This section of the interview keeps ringing in my head as I talk about this.
How did you develop, one thing I always hear about you is you have a very good relationship with the UFC brass. Some managers don't, some do.
Yeah.
How did you develop that good relationship? And in particular, I think it's with Sean and Mick, the matchmakers.
They do seem particularly close, don't they? Shelby and Mick not only matchmake for UFC fights, but for the Dana White Contender Series fights too. To put my conspiratorial thought to rest, I decided to split out Iridium fighter appearances and victories based on the weight classes that Mick and Sean matchmake for respectively. Before I show the data, remember that if Iridium's appearance rate is 50% or greater, that would mean that on average, every Dana White's Contender Series fight has at least one Iridium fighter in it. So let's see the stats on the weight classes Mick manages. Okay, and now Sean. So on average, 1 out of every 2 fights on Dana White's Contender Series that Sean matchmakes feature a fighter from Iridium. For Mick, the same figure is 1 out of every 5. Before the sample size police come after me, Sean has been involved in 131 fights compared to 128 for Mick. Here's the question that I have no answer to, but purely an opinion. House's job as a manager is to look out for the professional and financial well-being of those he represents. That is how he earns his percentage. So the question I ask of you, the viewer, is he doing that job ethically and effectively? Here's a story to set the stage for your answer. July of 2019, Sean O'Malley falls out of a matchup with Marlon Cheeto Vera due to a positive USADA test. Not wanting to lose out on a fight for his client, House offers the UFC the ability to sign one of his stable that has been bouncing around various regional promotions. That fighter? Noelin Hernandez, who was 9-2 as a professional MMA fighter at the time. Cheeto finishes him by rear naked choke, followed by another loss to Jack Shore, also by rear naked choke. Hernandez is then cut after going 0-2 in the UFC, bounced by 2 of the best contenders in the weight class. Noelin's record since the UFC? 2-3, likely putting the nail in the coffin for a fighter who turns 29 in March of 2023. On one side, getting Cheeto that late replacement puts another check in Vera's pocket that feeds his family. Hernandez also got paid 2 show checks for the fights. On the other side, though, it comes at the expense of Nolan's future opportunities in the sport, while also systematically reducing average fighter pay by dropping the competitiveness of the market as a whole. This is the point inherent to that initial question I asked of you, and ideally it is one that House asks himself every day. Now I have thrown a lot at you, but I need you to understand that the implications I am making are only a small piece of the pie. While this is all dawning on me, this question never left my mind. Why is Fight Pass and the UFC by extension paying for broadcasting rights to a tiny promotion, FAC, that I have never heard of? And that's where the rabbit hole gets deeper. The WEC was known for having the best fights and fighters in the lower weight divisions, with stars like Jose Aldo Jr., Dominic Cruz, and Uriah Faber, among many others. This acquisition made the UFC into the deepest MMA talent pool in the world. It's important to note that distinction of purchasing all of the assets of Pride. When one company acquires another, it's generally for a multitude of purposes. In the case of MMA companies, it's largely to acquire new talent and break into a new market, in this case Japan, with a pre-existing brand that fans already know. Creating a new brand is expensive and not a guarantee of success. Purchasing an existing brand is a much safer investment. By purchasing Pride, Zuffa and the UFC had just opened up shop in one of the 3 biggest markets for MMA at the time. While this is going on, Netflix was beginning a revolution that would completely redefine the content space for the modern age. From 2007 to 2012, Netflix began to alter its overall business strategy from a mail-based service to that of a content streaming platform. The financials were simple. Mailing DVDs is costly when successful. When unsuccessful, it is incredibly costly. Lost DVDs, damaged DVDs, and competition from legacy businesses like Blockbuster made growth an uphill climb. So Netflix reoriented by continuing to expand its offerings on a web-based platform. This drastically cut costs while revenue began to grow faster and faster. Venture capitalists, or VCs for short, caught on and began sinking capital into the company to buy more and more TV, movie, and other multimedia IP streaming rights. Quickly, IP refers to intellectual property. It is the legal term for the ownership of the rights to a specific product or service. If I try to post a full episode of The Office on YouTube, I will get sued for IP infringement by NBC. If I license the IP from them, I am free to use it within the bounds of our contract. The UFC was no different in its intentions, and just like Netflix, they were sitting on a pile of marketable IP with very little cost and high revenue potential. Remember before when the UFC purchased the assets of Pride? Those assets include their entire fight catalog, featuring some of the most incredible Pride Grand Prix in history, like Shogun Rua's legendary 2005 run through the middleweight tournament. That IP was a goldmine of content for a burgeoning streaming service. UFC Fight Pass launched in late 2013 with the intention of monetizing those assets from the 3 major purchases. But then, stagnation. See, the problem both the UFC and Netflix faced was that their model worked best ramping up, but then sort of stops growing once content is purchased and put live. You need to be constantly buying new content to give a reason for someone to subscribe to the service. Otherwise, they'll leave, and now you are burning cash rapidly. Netflix's solution was to begin producing its own unique content like House of Cards and Orange is the New Black. The UFC didn't really do much. In late 2014, they signed a broadcasting deal with Invicta, and followed that up in February of 2016 with deals to broadcast K1 and Glory kickboxing fights. They also signed 3 MMA deals in 2016 with Titan FC, TKO, and Cage Warriors. All 3 of those promotions had been on a hiatus prior to the deal and had only relaunched within a year prior to the rights purchase. There's an argument to be made that the Fight Pass deal revived those 3 promotions and their survival was inherently tied to it. But Fight Pass was foundationally limited by the fact that MMA content is a lot more bare bones than the content Netflix could purchase. There have only been so many MMA fights in the sport's 30-ish years of broadcast history. Netflix had years and years of television, anime, and movies to choose from. All of that changed when WME-IMG, now known as Endeavor, entered our picture in May of 2016, mere months after the K1 and Glory rights purchases. So this is a timeline of purchases and additions to UFC Fight Pass pre-Endeavor. Here's what it looks like after Endeavor. Something happened, huh? As I have talked about, Endeavor very quickly realized the writing on the wall that Netflix was etching. The future of broadcast was streaming. Get in or get left behind. When Endeavor came on board, they pivoted the UFC strategy to acquiring IP rights for smaller promotions to continue to build out both their catalog of past fights as well as their ability to stream live events through broadcast deals. Inarguably, a masterstroke of business strategic thinking. If you remember all the way back to my gambling video, I went into detail on Endeavor's up vertical acquisition strategy. It is obvious that Endeavor altered the UFC's plans to mirror their strategy, but in an MMA context. Let's quickly dive into a couple key promotions and their deals to contextualize what I mean by that. The deals really kicked off in mid-2018 with the UFC and M1 finally signing a deal that formed what is now known as UFC Russia and gave the UFC streaming rights to M1 fights and their past catalog. I say finally because of something I mentioned in the last video. M1 was incredibly averse to any dealings with the UFC after the purchases of Strikeforce, Pride, and the WEC. This is something specifically covered in the great video I referenced in my last essay by Robert Palin.
They also incidentally played a big part in the UFC finally debuting in Russia and China, two markets they've forever struggled to crack. Within just months of Endeavor taking over, they had secured a meeting with Russia's then Minister of Sport, Vitaly Mutko, leading to the UFC's first show in Moscow 2 years later. The longer term play here, however, was the unveiling of UFC Russia, an initiative that would see M1 Global help the promotion navigate the local market while operating a farming system. Longtime fans who know the history between the two promotions understand why this was significant. In 2009, the UFC attempted to sign Fedor Emelianenko, a client of Vadim Finkelstein, M1's majority owner. The negotiations would quickly fall apart though, with reports calling the UFC's refusal to co-promote a quote major obstacle. Moreover, their dealings were anything but cordial. Valentina Matvienko, M1's main financier, apparently laughed in Dana's face over his offer, while he would later claim that M1 blew a quote incredible deal, christening Vadim Finkelstein Vadummy. Now fast forward a decade later and they're kind of co-promoting, which highlights a company willing to operate in a different way. Finkelstein even referenced this, saying that the UFC changed its global expansion strategy when Endeavor took over. He said that under Zuffa they were trying to become monopolists by buying up competitors like M1, but now they're willing to work with promotions where it's mutually beneficial.
I highlight M1 because not only is it the earliest broadcast deal signed by the Endeavor-led UFC, it also represents such an important turning point in MMA history. As Robert talked about, M1 resisted the UFC because of its fear that the UFC was monopolizing the entire MMA market. An optimistic reason for them finally dealing with the UFC is the reasoning given by M1 at the time of purchase. The UFC had halted its monopolization efforts, so they were finally willing to meet at the negotiating table. A more cynical take would be that M1 realized that their efforts were in vain, and the UFC had won. It was a matter of time before they were squeezed dry of talent and had to close down their shop. I encourage you to keep these both in your mind as I continue. But like Netflix's struggles that occurred in parallel to the UFC's Fight Pass expansion, nothing lasts forever. Right? There's a natural conclusion to the Netflix story that we should see mirrored in the UFC. As Netflix grew larger and larger, buying and developing more and more IP, a natural problem occurs. Because Brian Campbell enjoyed my last video, I'm going to use a Morning Kombat reference to explain. We don't talk about Bruno. To those without children or young family members, Encanto was one of the most popular animated movies in Disney's recent history. As such, I'm going to call the following issue the Encanto problem. The history doesn't really mimic the hypothetical I'm giving considering Encanto was released after Disney+, but the logic is historical. So let's say that you are Bob Iger, the CEO of Disney, and you just released an absolute mega hit in the film Encanto. Encanto does its run in theaters, and now it's on sale in physical media, meaning Blu-ray, DVD, whatever. But there's a problem. Who buys physical media anymore? Get with the times, Grandpa. Streaming is where it's at. So Netflix calls you up. Hey Bob, we want to buy the streaming rights to Encanto. No chance, you tell them. Why not? Because there's no way you are selling the IP rights to one of your biggest hits when it is still setting the world ablaze in popularity. But now, people aren't seeing it because it's not streaming. Clock is ticking. You want to milk this IP for every cent you can, but signing a deal with Netflix benefits them at your expense. What if you make a streaming service so that you can cash in fully on the hype of Encanto, but you can't make a streaming service just for Encanto, right? What if you make the service and stream every piece of your massive IP catalog that isn't sold to someone else, and as those deals expire, you add the content to your new startup, Disney+. Now that makes a lot more sense, right? Well, Disney wasn't the only one that realized this. Paramount, NBC, Warner Media, and countless others had the same dilemma and all realized the same conclusion. Make your own. Now that dents Netflix heavily. They don't have a treasure trove of owned IP. They license others' IP on a contract with a limited time. Basically every legacy media outlet launches their own streaming platform, and steadily saps you of your market advantage while essentially rebuilding a cable package but with streaming platforms. Therein lies the Encanto problem. As your streaming service becomes more successful and profitable, your IP licensors are going to realize that they can cut you out and make more money on their IP. There goes your profits. This was the conundrum that Netflix realized early. They realized they need to become producers of content and sank billions of dollars into productions like The Witcher, Rian Johnson's mystery movies, and the award-winning Roma. Like Netflix before them, the UFC began buying up those streaming rights, and as these promotions gained ever larger audiences, the Encanto problem began to appear in MMA. Promotions used the springboard of popularity they gained from accessing the UFC's massive audience to build their own brands up and launch their own broadcast platforms to absorb 100% of the profits from fans' eyeballs. Oh, wait. I have not seen one case of a Fight Pass promotion attempting to launch their own competitor platform. The closest is Invicta, but they are nowhere near successful enough to be considered a refutation of my point. Even competitors like Bellator and ONE don't even have an easily accessible fight library. Let's dig deeper into one specific promotion that encapsulates a large portion of what I think is going on: Cage Warriors. Cage Warriors was founded all the way back in 2001 by Dougie Truman. He ran the promotion until 2010 when Graham Boylan took the reins. Boylan led an expansionary effort to try and build Cage Warriors into a true competitor for the UFC. They aggressively spent their capital resources to expand their market as far as possible. But they ultimately failed in November of 2014, leading to the promotion going into hiatus and Boylan resigning months later in February of 2015. Months after his resignation in June of 2015, Boylan announced on the MMA Hour that he would be restarting the promotion. The promotion did not immediately start putting on events until April 15th of 2016. 2 days later, on April 17th, 2016, the UFC Fight Pass announced that they had closed a deal for the broadcast rights to Cage Warriors' live fights and past catalog. It's important to note Cage Warriors has produced some of the biggest names in UFC history: Michael Bisping, Dan Hardy, and most importantly, Conor McGregor. Now, Conor left the promotion to sign with the UFC in February of 2013. November of the following year, they shut down. Boylan spent all of his resources to try and build the promotion up around the talent he possessed, which included a fighter that would go on to become the biggest star in the sport's history, and failed. But Fight Pass offered a lifeline, so he accepted. Now, I speak of Boylan specifically for a very important reason. In the lead-up to UFC 282, Paddy Pimblett did an interview with Dana White where he excoriated Ariel Helwani for what Paddy claimed was his greed over not paying fighters for interviews.
I hate all these journalists, especially the ones what earn off us, know what I mean? Like Ariel Helwani in particular, like he loves earning money off fighters.
Something much more interesting occurred to me when listening to this, though.
Then he says, I'm coming from San Diego, all that. I say, how about Monday, November 21st? He writes back, I'll speak to Graham, as I'll be with him most of the time. Graham is his longtime manager, Graham Boylan, also promoter for Cage Warriors.
Ah, and there it is. Just like Wooster before him, Boylan is blurring the lines between manager and promoter matchmaker. Now, I was watching that piece by Ariel while writing the gambling essay, specifically the section on Molly McCann, so immediately a switch flipped for me. Who is Molly's manager? I tweeted that out and got the expected answer: Graham Boylan. You see, Molly McCann also went through Cage Warriors before being signed by the UFC. She won the strawweight title, vacated, and signed with the UFC. Boylan also represents Jack Shore, who won the Cage Warriors Bantamweight Championship, vacated, and signed with the UFC. Boylan represents Jai Herbert, who won the Cage Warriors Lightweight Championship, vacated, and signed with the UFC. So, let's incorporate some data, shall we? Let's look at all 14 Cage Warriors champions that were crowned after the Fight Pass deal, but only those who decided to sign directly with the UFC, not Dana White's Contender Series. The 14 fighters on screen fit the criteria, so now let's add in who manages them based on my current research. To the best of my knowledge, here are the fighters not represented by Boylan: Modestas Bukauskas, who is repped by Iridium. I cannot find managers for Oscar Piachota or Nad Nuramani. Finally, Ian Gary is represented by his wife, a former presenter for Cage Warriors. Mathematically, 71% of fighters fitting this setup are managed by the promoter of Cage Warriors, Graham Boylan. But let's dive a little bit deeper. Let's talk directly about the concept that I have been hinting at in this video. Like I said in the last essay, guild economics rule MMA, not a market like my prior solution would require. To really drill in this point, I think we need to visualize it. Let's look at the areas of coverage for some of the major overseas promotions the UFC assigned to Fight Pass. M1, Aries, Cage Warriors, and LFA. If we squint, I think we can make out a map of the major regions of MMA talent, right? Russia, France, the UK and Ireland, and Brazil. Who runs these promotions? Aries, Fernand Lopez, promoter, manager, and coach. Cage Warriors, Graham Boylan, promoter and manager. LFA, Ed Suarez, promoter and manager. Instead of buying promotions outright and expensively, the UFC appears to be using the broadcast deals to fund regional competitors, steadily turning them into contracted feeder leagues. Think of it like this. The UFC offers these promotions cash for their broadcasting rights, which keeps them profitable. These promotions can advertise to up-and-coming fighters that they will gain increased exposure at their promotion compared to a non-Fight Pass associated regional promotion. That's an easy answer for a fighter, right? Over time, more fighters leave non-Fight Pass oriented promotions to join the Fight Pass ones, grinding the losing promotions into dust. Good for the Fight Pass affiliated promotions. Their competition is now gone, and they are free to grow with their talent. But wait, I haven't found a single one of these promotions that doesn't have a UFC clause in their contracts. If the UFC calls to sign one of their fighters, they are released from that promotion and are free to sign with the UFC. Therein lies a problem, right? I would argue that there are 3 stages to the Fight Pass deal. The early stage featuring promotions like Aries, where the MMA scene is just ramping up. Aries is able to stall out competition through the money they make off the broadcast deal, steadily waiting for competition to dry up. Once that happens, we enter the middle phase encapsulated by Cage Warriors. With no competition, Boylan and promoters like him have the potential to assert undue influence on the best fighters in their promotion. This could take the form of influencing them to sign with them for a one-way ticket to the big show, the UFC. But a question remains unanswered. Why is this a problem? To answer that, we need to look at what we can term late-stage Fight Pass promotions, and the one promotion whose lead promoter I purposely failed to mention earlier, M1 Global. Alright, here's some facts about M1. In July of 2018, M1 signed their deal with the UFC to create a co-promotion called UFC Russia to use as a farm system for developing regional talent before debuting in the UFC. Notable fighters from M1 include Shavkat Rakhmonov, Movsar Evloev, and Islam Makhachev. Unquestionably incredible signings for the UFC. So let's look at some up-and-coming fighters from M1 to be on the lookout for in the future. Someone like reigning M1 heavyweight world champion, Alexander Volkov, who has been with the UFC since November of 2016? Okay, maybe they just shut down their heavyweight division, right? Let's talk about a premier division like welterweight. M1's reigning welterweight champion is Shavkat Rakhmonov, fighting in the UFC since October of 2020. Huh. Okay, well, why don't we just look at every champion? I am sure they just haven't gotten around to a new title fight at welterweight, right? Interesting. Every single reigning champion in M1 is currently or has recently been signed by the UFC. Very weird. When was M1's last event? September 2020. And there we have something to think about. In July of 2018, M1 signs up to co-promote with the UFC. 2 years later, they host their last event due to COVID restrictions and have yet to reopen. The UFC absorbed all their major talent. What about the rest of the fighters who were not yet UFC caliber? Most likely scattered to the wind of various up-and-coming regional promotions in Russia, I assume. This is to me where the Encanto problem returns to the forefront. So why no Encanto problem? Let's return to the Disney-Netflix negotiation to complete this plot arc. What if instead of Netflix calling Disney CEO Bob Iger after Encanto explodes to negotiate a deal, they instead had a contract with Disney and Bob Iger that they could automatically purchase any IP rights at a set price whenever they felt like it? Now, Bob would never have signed that deal, right? He has absolutely zero leverage to do his fiduciary duty to the shareholders of Disney and the ownership of the IP that the artists who created Encanto retain. What if instead, Bob Iger signed a different deal with Netflix and the contract worked as follows? Netflix could purchase the IP from Disney at a pre-negotiated price, but, importantly, Bob Iger would personally receive 10% of the revenue derived from Encanto. That would be incredibly unethical, right? Disney would never allow him to do that. But what about a promotion that would essentially be bankrupt without the Fight Pass broadcast deal, like we saw in a revived Cage Warriors? They are not in a position to negotiate their way out of that Netflix Bob Iger IP deal, right? I would argue the Encanto problem will never occur in MMA, as it currently is constructed. These promoter managers could hypothetically function as the gatekeeper to the UFC for the top talent in their promotion, thereby wielding their conflict of interest as a cudgel to leverage those fighters to sign with them. But what about the young fighters and veterans who are not top UFC prospects? Their development is stifled by a promotion that functions more as a farm system for the UFC than a genuine regional promotion devoted to developing homegrown talent. This once again tracks back to my mathematical analogy from my gambling video. These promotions have realized that volume fighter intake is more consistent than putting in effort to develop stars that are already in the promotion. And therein lies the trade-off. The system I have outlined helps the talented get in faster, but caps their earning potential. The conflicted promoter manager can't play hardball with the UFC in contract negotiations out of fear of them going to a different person to be that gatekeeper. This inherently lowers fighter pay of the top stars as their managers are not able to fulfill their fiduciary duties to them owing to the conflict inherent to their dual roles as promoter and manager. So the top talent is stifled, while concurrently the lesser talent is essentially ignored and stuck in an MMA purgatory, never able to actually break through without extenuating circumstances that allows a promoter manager to consider them for his pathway to the UFC. So why should you care? It may seem like the UFC broadcast partnerships create a highway for the most talented fighters to reach the UFC. I would argue instead that the UFC has built a Byzantine bureaucracy that rewards the politically connected over those deserving of a promotion. And why would the UFC participate in this system? Antitrust laws. As I said in the last video, the UFC is actively engaged in an antitrust lawsuit. Purchasing promotions bolsters the case against them. So why not repurpose Endeavor's business model of up vertical integration that I talked about in my UFC business structure video? That strategy inherently shields you from antitrust lawsuits while retaining your structural advantage. You see, this is much bigger than FAC or any one promotion management company. The 3 stages of Fight Pass promotions I have outlined create a scary future for the sport of MMA. Early stage promotions like Ares sing the UFC's blessings for resurrecting or sustaining the financials of those promotions. Eventually, they win out over regional competition, thus opening up the possibility for the promoter to exert leverage on fighters that are essentially stuck in these promotional ecosystems. As the UFC absorbs more and more top talent, the promotion begins to enter a death spiral, and one unforeseen event like the pandemic could be the nail in the coffin for their future. The promoter manager can live off the revenues from their fighters, but as they retire or get cut from the UFC, or are just poached by larger firms, the Faustian bargain ends and the devil comes to collect his due. To understand the true foundational issues seeping into the sport of MMA, we will have to discuss the elephant in the room, Ali Abdelaziz. The thing about Ali that differs from my prior examples is just how public his issues have been. Ali is easily the most widely reported on figure in MMA management. I don't have other stories to add to the picture, so I think our time is best spent summarizing the key elements of his conflicts of interest with promotions. Then, we move on to the more video-specific discussion of regional centralization and control that Ali is building. The most reported on and publicly known conflict is of course Ali's position at the promotion formerly known as WSOF, World Series of Fighting, now known as PFL. Ali was an executive at World Series of Fighting and functioned as their matchmaker, a practice Fernand, Boylan, and Wooster have continued in his example. The biggest difference though is that Ali got into some serious hot water over his association with the promotion, He details it himself a bit in the following conversation with Ariel Helwani. Ali has a bit of a tendency to ramble, so I have to cut this section up a bit to make his thoughts more concise. You can watch the full interview in the link in the description.
Ronnie, Ali, it's good to see you. You have been in the news as of late. There's a lot to discuss with you outside of PFL, so let's get right to it. Let's first get to the World Series of Fighting story. You used to be their manager and the executive vice president for that promotion, but I understand that you have some news regarding that, so the floor is yours. What do you want to say?
Yeah, it's just it's been a great run with World Series of Fighting, and the amazing group, everyone there. I have nothing but love and respect for Ray Safo, Keith Evans, Carlos Silva, Kevin, and we're always going to be family. But I have a meeting a couple weeks ago with Bob Bennett, Athletic Commission, and he's an amazing guy, and he gave me some great advice, and we talked about it. All this year, how I got into this business, managing Renzo Gracie, and this is what I've been, and my relationship with a lot of the fighters under Dominance MMA. We train together, we sweat together, and become family, and I realized, after 3 years, and it's just too much for me. It's too much for me, for my family, and I have to choose one love. I have two love, being a promoter and being a manager. But at this moment, we just, me and World Series of Fighting, we talked about it, and, we decided I think it's better for me just to focus on Dominance MMA management, try to grow it. World Series of Fighting is an amazing promotion. Many fighters are lucky to have him around to give guys opportunity. They mean very well. And I think it's just they're going to grow and grow. World Series of Fighting is going to move on without me, with me. It's become a big brand. Got great people behind it, like Bruce Dyfik. He funded this company and given a lot of opportunity. But at this moment, I talked to Nevada Athletic Commission. And listen, all along, I feel like, I never hide it. I never said, oh, I'm not a manager. I said I'm always going to be part of Frankie Edgar's life, part of Verdum's life, part of Renzo Gracie's life, Rafael Natal's life, Khabib life. This is my family also, but, I realize I cannot have two love. I have to choose one love, and World Series of Fighting helped me make this decision, and I'm always going to be part of.
So the regulatory boards of combat sports were the main drivers of his resignation. As we have covered, the main problem revolves around Ali's ability to utilize his matchmaking capabilities to theoretically leverage fighters into signing deals with his management company, Dominance. Two key examples of fighters that signed with Dominance while in World Series of Fighting are Justin Gaethje and Marlon Moraes. The WSOF example is important because it shows that there is a background precedent set that managers need to be separate from promotions. Yet, I have shown you multiple examples where that is simply not the case. So Ali is basically the only one who has been punished for this setup, while others are allowed to continue. Ali's continuing influence on the PFL is a subject of substantial debate, but to keep the video focused, I have linked to a great article on it in the description. So with the manager and promotional conflict section out of the way, let's move to the second part, which is the centralization of regional talent into Fight Pass feeder league promotions. Ali's influence in this is not like the others. Ali's second-in-command at Dominance MMA, Rizvan Magomedov, is one of the founders and is the matchmaker for Khabib's Eagle FC promotion. But they do not have a Fight Pass deal based on my study. They seem to function a bit like a retirement home for Ali's past their prime fighters like Junior Dos Santos. But this segues us perfectly into what I see as the bigger structure that Ali is building. A manager like Boylan, and by proxy Cage Warriors as a whole, is attempting to centralize talent in the UK and Ireland. Fernand and Aries are the same, but for France. Ali has a bigger ambition though, the Russian Caucasus and the greater region of the Middle East. A key theme in this video and my last is the corrupting influence of vast amounts of highly available liquid capital. The UFC built their new business model on the back of two of the most liquid growth industries in America, gambling and crypto. But here's the thing. Gambling is illegal in every major format of Islamic jurisprudence. Gambling violates a key tenet of Islam known as riba. Riba is a concept in parallel to usury in Christianity. Simply, it's the thorough ban on collecting interest, so gambling is out as a source of capital. But these regions have another fountain of liquid capital in the form of fossil fuel reserves, As such, they replaced the capital influence of gambling companies with that of governmental bodies that own those reserves. Unfortunately, we can't view Ali's domination of this market through the same lens as Boylan and Lopez because of that prior point. Middle Eastern MMA is still growing, so we will be skipping it entirely for this essay. We are going to instead focus purely on the Russian Caucasus, and specifically Chechnya. Any discussion of Chechnya has to start with its head of state, Ramzan Kadyrov. Kadyrov has been in the news recently with his invites of Cody Garbrandt, Justin Gaethje, Kamaru Usman, and Henry Cejudo, all managed by Ali, to Ramzan's son's birthday party, as well as a photo op with him. You see, Ramzan's son also has MMA dreams, and his dad just happens to wield the muscle to get some of the biggest names in the UFC to train with. But why does he have this muscle? To understand, you will have to understand the basic functioning of an oligarchic statelet like Chechnya. I'm going to put forward a hypothetical to explain what I believe to be occurring based on a mixture of conversations with people involved and my own research. Let's say you're an enterprising young manager who wants to sign a talented fighter from Chechnya. If this were, say, Brazil, you would go to that fighter and offer them a contract for representation. But in regions like Chechnya, that is not how things work. In order to profit off a citizen of Chechnya, you will need the approval of state officials, which inevitably means you will need Ramzan's okay. You ask for and receive Ramzan's acceptance, but he tells you that you owe him in the future. So you sign the prospect and a couple more and go about your day. A couple years later, you get a call from Ramzan. Hey, get Kamaru Usman, Gaethje, and Cejudo to come to my son's birthday party. You tell him that they are busy training or something else, blah blah blah. Ramzan hangs up. All of a sudden, you have a phone call from every Chechen on your roster telling you that they want to break their contract with you. So, you get those fighters to go to the birthday party because you received the message loud and clear. As an aside, I think that MMA media focuses too much on the issue of sports washing, rather than the greater issue I believe to be at play. Let's say you get the flu and have a fever. When someone asks you what you are sick with, you say the flu, right? Not that you have the fever. Sports washing is the metaphorical fever to a greater concept, state nationalism. I would argue that sports washing is just a Westerner's perception of the greater concept of nationalist competition in athletics. Since the globalization of the world economy began sometime in the late colonial period, certain parts of the world have ruled culture, economics, and politics by nature of being in the right place at the right time. I live in America, where we crown the winner of the Super Bowl as the world champion, a sport that basically only the US practices, yet we are the world champions? Now let's say a new sport comes around that citizens of your state happen to have a leg up on other substantially larger and more influential nations due to your history in martial arts. This is your opportunity to become a player on the world stage of said sport. You also happen to control the purse strings of your entire nation as its chief oligarch. So you start funneling millions of dollars into improving your athletes so that your state can be spoken in the same breath as nations that have long dominated the athletic world. So it's not really about covering your crimes then, is it? It's about your pride as a Chechen. Or how about Colombian? You see, this isn't something new. It's a human cycle perpetuated as long as we've been competing with each other culturally and athletically. So no problem, right? Here's the thing. I wrote this essay very specifically. Everything I have described in detail so far is purely connecting dots of public reporting and bringing in historical examples and precedents from business. A keen critical thinker has either written or is actively writing me a comment saying, "So what? Why does this actually matter?" Well, keen critical thinker, let's travel all the way back to 1967, and I will tell you why. March 13th, 1967. A man by the name of Andres Escobar was born in the capital of Colombia, Medellin. Growing up, Andres' talent on the football pitch was apparent to any and everyone who saw him. He even became a professional footballer at the age of 19, playing for the premier club of Medellin, known as Atlético Nacional. Concurrent to Andres' rise onto the football scene, another Medellin resident, also by the name of Escobar, was rising to become the richest man in the world off the back of the international trade and export of narcotics. Pablo Escobar was a massive fan of football, especially Colombian football, and as such, he began funneling more and more money into Atlético Nacional as it was his favorite team. Pablo also had a penchant for public service, running for and winning a seat in Colombia's Congress. Like Ramzan, Pablo wielded his power through violence, intimidation, and financial dealings, becoming inarguably the most powerful man in Colombia. Pablo's financial influence in Atletico led it to improving substantially yearly until they were one of the premier South American clubs. But that wasn't enough for Pablo. He was motivated by his state national identity and wanted to prove Colombia was the premier destination for football talent in South America. Not in an effort to hide his criminality, no, out of what he likely saw as his civic duty. But that didn't mean he went about it legally. Multiple referees were assassinated publicly when Pablo believed their calls were incorrect or possibly biased. This led to a culture of fear in the sport, but no one had the resources nor the will to combat his influence. So, it continued until one fateful day in 1994. During the FIFA World Cup, Colombia was facing the US in their second group match. The score was tied 0-0 when Andres accidentally deflected the ball into his own goal, putting Colombia down 1-0 to the US. Colombia went on to lose that match and were knocked out of their group following the next match, thus ending their hopes of bringing a FIFA World Cup home to Colombia. On the evening of the 1st of July 1994, 5 days after the elimination of Colombia from the World Cup, Escobar went to El Indio nightclub at approximately 3 a.m. the next morning. Escobar was alone in the parking lot of El Indio in his car when 3 men appeared. Escobar was shot 6 times with a pistol. It was reported that the killer shouted, "Goal," after every shot, once for each time the South American football commentator said it during the broadcast. Escobar was taken to the hospital, where he died 45 minutes later. This is why all of these things I have told you matter. I hear people say they don't want politics in MMA, but they are being too imprecise. You don't want the sport we love to preach politics you disagree with at you, and nor do I. But you are operating on a false assertion that politics isn't ingrained in the sport. You need not fear politics being brought into MMA. It's already here, and men like Kadyrov have brought it in a form that is way worse than your complaints over hearing about fighter pay. Here's an example. Let's talk about Abdulkarim Edilov. Edilov is a former MMA fighter that had a very brief one-fight stint in the UFC. He was a Chechen fighter that had close ties to Kadyrov. On December 29, 2022, he was found dead after publicly breaking with Kadyrov in the prior couple weeks. Doesn't take a huge stretch to question the connection between the public break and his untimely death at 30 years old. But murder isn't my only fear. Ramzan is also very close with Dagestani light heavyweight Mahomed Ankalaev. After Mahomed drew with Jan Blachowicz for the title, Ramzan texted Dana White and then publicly released his text ordering Dana to award Mahomed the title due to fight-fixing allegations. In my eyes, we are only at the beginning of the insipid influence of state capital into the MMA ecosystem. As the sport grows larger, so too will the problems that occur when associating with these types of characters. My concerns over gambling's influence are mirrored in perfect parallel with my concerns over state capital investment. If you too are concerned about gambling, then you must also be concerned about state capital investment because they form the same problem in MMA. I received many comments on my last video saying, I am glad that X promotion has banned gambling and its negative influence. I expect each and every one of you to be as concerned with Ramzan's influence and actions as you were with gambling. Conversely, most of the fan reaction I see to reports of Ramzan's actions are generally a resounding, so what? This is why you should care. What happens when Ramzan starts paying fighters to take dives? Kraus can be arrested. Ramzan can't. What happens if there is a controversial decision in a fight between a Dagestani fighter and a Chechen? Not a huge stretch to imagine Ramzan taking action against that Dagestani fighter regardless of the merits of the fixing claim. The UFC has become way too political. Not in the small way you likely came into this essay thinking. The real political issue in the UFC comes in the form of the growing, corrupting influence of state capital into the very fabric of the sport. Not culture war nonsense like your favorite fighter's opinion of this week's internet-ordained Morpheus, nor your anger over reporters' contradictory take on current events. It's time to see the bigger picture of what's happening in the sport as a whole, because you can have an effect. Support journalists doing actual investigative work, not just towing the UFC's company line. The sport we love needs to have a light shone on the dark and decrepit underbelly. One last point before I end this. I have spoken to multiple fighters in the time since I released the gambling video. Universally, they are incredibly supportive of the choice Francis made, as they see it as a net benefit to the sport as a whole. Yet, they are unable to speak out publicly on it. Why? Because they fear retribution from the UFC universally. Not just from Dana White personally, but the tentacles he wields in the forms I have outlined in this video, from questionable relationships with executives to Fight Pass broadcast deals. Dana wants you to think he runs the UFC like Ayn Rand's metaphorical Galt's Gulch from Atlas Shrugged. The UFC far more resembles H.G. Wells' Animal Farm, though. It is a structure governed by fear of reprisal sold to you in the form of freedom from tyranny. That structure laid fertile ground for Kadyrov to begin sinking his influence deeper and deeper into the fabric of the sport. What happens when the next Abdulkarim Edilov is your favorite Dagestani or Chechen fighter who ended up on the wrong end of a big fight or publicly embarrassed the state? Then you may care, but it will be too late.